There we go. In the summer of 2020, Americans experienced a breakthrough in public consciousness of the disconnect between safety and criminalization. The converging forces of a more multiracial electorate, overwhelming skepticism of the war on drugs, and the growing power of a young progressive movement reached a tipping point just months before the 2020 election. In Maryland, community leaders who had been working for years to raise awareness of out-of-control incarceration rates and police violence suddenly found a willing audience, not just in the public, but in state and local government as well. After decades of toggling between tough on crime and community policing, for the first time, some politicians seemed receptive to the idea that policing and incarceration needed to be fundamentally reconsidered. Within those admittedly difficult conversations, few topics are more sensitive than domestic violence and intimate partner violence. Yet these cases are precisely those that would benefit most from new approaches to safety that prioritize root causes over criminal enforcement. I'm joined tonight by Leigh Goodmark, a professor at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law and author of Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, a balanced policy approach to intimate partner violence. Professor Goodmark, let me bring you on. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I have so much I want to talk to you about because I think your work is really fascinating. And I've really enjoyed reading some of your written pieces to prepare for this. You've been published in the New York Times and other more popular spaces. You've also written a couple of books. I think the other one that we have talked about a little bit in communicating with our campaign is Imperfect Victims. But why don't you take us back to the beginning and just tell us how you started working on domestic violence and intimate partner violence, or studying them, researching them as issues, and how has your engagement with this topic shifted your own viewpoint over time?
Absolutely. We would have to go back to law school, and that's a very long time ago now. So long ago that at the law school that I attended, there wasn't a real clinical program. I'm a clinical law professor at the University of Maryland. Our clinics help our students practice law before they get out into practice. The idea is you don't want a lawyer who's never done anything before they get out into practice. We didn't have that at my law school. We had a project where you could help people with domestic violence cases because those cases could pretty easily be done without a whole lot of legal knowledge in theory. And so that's when I started doing the work, but I really didn't get into it in earnest until I was a legal services lawyer in Washington, DC in the late 90s, mid 90s, late 90s. At that time in Washington, DC, there weren't really organizations dedicated to providing comprehensive services to victims of domestic violence. And along with some friends who came out of law school at about the same time, a bunch of us started doing that work. And at the time that I started doing that work, if you had asked me what I thought should happen to the people who were perpetrating domestic violence, I would have told you they need to be locked up. They're monsters, they won't change, and the only way to keep people safe is to send them to prison. And so I was a prototypical carceral feminist. I believed very strongly that the intervention of the state, the punitive intervention of the state, and the use of carceral systems was absolutely essential to keep people safe. And obviously that's changed over time. You don't get to a book called Decriminalizing Domestic Violence without changing that attitude. And the thing that really changed for me was working with clients and having clients say, this is not what I need. This is not what I want. Having my partner locked up deprives me of economic support. It deprives me of parenting assistance. It makes me an outcast in my community. It exposes my community to harm. When I call the police, I get arrested. When I call the police, I am harmed. All of the reasons why people are reluctant to engage the criminal legal system were things that my clients have been saying to me for the last 25 years. And so over that period of time, I've become a fairly serious critic of the legal system's response to intimate partner violence, and specifically the criminal legal system's response to intimate partner violence. That really happened because of being in the courts day in and day out, and then doing the research to back up what my clients were telling me. which was that the criminal legal system wasn't helping them, and in many cases, it was actually harming them.
No, I don't know if this is something that you feel ready or comfortable sharing, but I am really interested. We have a lot of public defenders on this campaign. A lot of people whose politics were shaped by experiences in the courtroom. I wonder if there are any cases or a case that stick out to you as a moment where you really had to take a step back and start to let your views shift.
Absolutely. So I can think of two. The first was when I was still a very, very young legal services lawyer, and I used to love to do divorces. And I love to do divorces because it felt like I was helping this person break the last legal tie between themselves and the people who were harming them. And so I said to my client that, and I was 24, I wasn't married, I didn't have kids, I knew nothing, really nothing of the world. And I said to my client, aren't you so excited? And she said, no. She said, I didn't want my relationship to end like this. And I didn't imagine that this was what was going to happen. I don't want to get divorced. My children are going to be without their father on a regular basis. None of this is what I wanted. And it was the first time where I thought, oh, I'm helping to break apart a family. That has consequences. And so that was the first step. The second step really happened 8 years ago. And so I had been moving towards, I had been a fairly serious critic of the criminal legal system's response to intimate partner violence, but I still believed that somehow, if we did the right things, that the system could be responsive, the system could be helpful, and that people needed to be incarcerated in some circumstances. 8 years ago, I started representing criminalized survivors of violence, people who have been incarcerated for crimes related to their own victimization. And it was going into prisons on a regular basis that made me say, this system can't be fixed. There's nothing that can be fixed by caging someone. There's nothing that can be fixed by inflicting the kind of trauma on someone that prisons inflict on people. Violence is never going to stop violence, and that's what prison is. Incarceration is a form of violence. It's a state-sanctioned violence. And so I had been moving towards abolition without using that language, without feeling comfortable with the concept, and feeling pretty unsure about being able to embrace that position because I didn't know what was going to replace it. And so that's something abolitionists talk about all the time. It's like, we don't necessarily have to have the system that we're going to plunk down in its place before we can move towards abolition. But I didn't get that at that time. And so I would say it was really, those are the two moments that stick out the most for me. Being there when someone is released from incarceration is the best thing that I have ever experienced as a lawyer. That tells me something about my own relationship to that system. It is a deeply destructive, deeply harmful system. I want no part of it.
You alluded a couple of times to what you understand to be some facts about how the criminal legal system interacts with these kinds of cases. But could you just sort of go in and unpack a little bit? How do we know that policing and incarceration are not decreasing instances of domestic violence and intimate partner violence?
I would argue that we know it because rates of violence are not decreasing in a way that they should, given the resources that we pour into criminalization, and that the research isn't there on deterrence. But let me go backwards and unpack both of those things. So my argument is that the criminal legal system isn't working. If what we mean by working is it's not decreasing rates of violence, it's not deterring violence. So as to decreasing rates of violence, you will hear President Biden say that intimate partner violence has decreased 67% since the inception of the Violence Against Women Act. And the Violence Against Women Act, pretty famously, is a deeply carceral act. It was part of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. It is steeped in the criminal legal system. It is primarily a funding mechanism for the criminal legal system more than it is anything else. And while it is true that rates of intimate partner violence have dropped 67% since 1994, what that doesn't tell you is that all violent crime has decreased since 1994. And rates of violent crime decreased the same amount as the decreases in intimate partner violence, but we weren't putting billions now of dollars into the response to all violent crime. We were putting billions of dollars into policing, prosecution, courts, and community-based agencies in their support of law enforcement. And we got the exact same return on investment. So just from a return on investment kind of standpoint, pouring all of that money into the criminal legal system did not give us any greater decrease in rates of intimate partner violence than happened naturally. So that's the first part of the argument. The second part is about deterrence. Deterrence theorists will tell you that deterrence doesn't really work at all, that for deterrence to work, you have to know what the consequences of your actions are, understand that they're going to happen, choose to act anyway. So few people have all of those things happen that deterrence as a general concept is pretty suspect for most criminologists. The reason that I think you can argue that deterrence isn't working in the context of intimate partner violence is because what the research shows us is that arrest doesn't necessarily decrease future violence. So in 1984, there was a big study where two sociologists, Lawrence Sherman and Richard Burke, found that arrest decreased intimate partner violence. It led folks all over the country to adopt what are called mandatory arrest policies that require police to make an arrest anytime they have probable cause to do so, only in intimate partner violence cases. And at the time, Sherman and Burke said, you got to replicate these results before people adopt these policies. Of course, no one waited for the replication, but what the replication showed was that in some cases, arrest did deter future violence. In some cases, it had no effect at all. In some cases, it actually increased future violence. So there's no consistent data that tells us that arrest decreases recidivist violence. There's no data that shows us that prosecution decreases recidivist violence. There is some data that says that when someone is convicted of a crime of intimate partner violence and then closely monitored, they are less likely to repeat. There is no evidence that incarceration alone decreases intimate partner violence or deters intimate partner violence. Again, there is some research that says if you incarcerate someone and then closely monitor them post-release, they are less likely to recidivate. Not surprising. If you sit on top of somebody, they're less likely to do the same things over again. So the research is pretty clear that criminalization in and of itself is not having the effects that we think it's having. And then from there, you kind of have to ask, even if it was working, would it be worth the cost? And so there are significant costs associated with the criminalization of intimate partner violence. And I would argue that, in fact, it's not worth the cost at all. I'm happy to talk a little bit about what those costs are.
Yeah, why don't we get into it? I think, part of the backdrop that I mentioned in the introduction to this conversation is that this is a very challenging subject to talk about in a way that sticks to actually trying to find the best possible outcomes for people caught in these relationships and these systems, because it's so emotional. It's so frightening or heinous in some cases, and it's something that gets thrown out there very much as a political football in these broader debates about criminal justice reform, in a way that's really challenging. So I would love to hear you just expand more on that last point.
Yeah, so before I get there, I just want to respond directly to what you've just said. I think that actually this is the hardest place, particularly for progressive people, to think about criminal system reform and to think about abolition. And I think that's true because it brings two core issues or two core commitments into tension. So on the one hand, many progressive folks feel very strongly about decreasing mass incarceration. On the other hand, they feel very strongly about taking violence against women seriously. And they think that those things are in tension and that you can't do both of those things because the only way to take violence against women seriously is to do it through criminalization. That's simply not true. And in fact, criminalization exacerbates many of the correlates of intimate partner violence. So one of the costs of criminalization is that it's making intimate partner violence worse. And there are really three kind of concrete ways I'll point to that it does that. One, criminalization increases the economic stress for families. And economic stress is highly correlated with the perpetration of and victimization of intimate partner violence. So criminalization means it's harder to find a job, you lose wages, it's harder to keep a job. All of those things combine to make it more likely that you're going to experience intimate partner violence in your household. The second is community instability. So when you have people moving in and out of prison because of intimate partner violence, or you have people who are moving in and out of the court system as a result of intimate partner violence, you're destabilizing communities. Community instability is also highly correlated with the perpetration of intimate partner violence. And then the third thing is trauma. So just being involved in the criminal legal system is traumatic, but incarceration is, exponentially more traumatic. People are likely to witness violence or be victims of violence while they're incarcerated. And then they take that violence with them back out into their communities and into their relationships, having done nothing to address their underlying trauma or the things that were causing them to use violence in the first place. Not surprisingly, trauma and perpetration are highly correlated. So the things that we're doing to intervene are actually making the problem worse. Then there's a whole kind of second subset of things. One is the tendency in the United States to do what Jonathan Simon calls governing through crime. The idea that we're going to take every social problem that we have, make it a crime, put people in prison and not deal with it. And then we're going to allocate resources into the criminal legal system rather than allocating them to communities to do the work that we actually need to do. Criminalization is harmful to people of color. The same racism that exists in the criminal legal system writ large is very much present in adjudication of domestic violence cases. Criminalization is particularly hard on the people that it was meant to benefit. So after the adoption of mandatory arrest policies, for example, arrest rates, not surprisingly, went up significantly across the country. They went up more for women than anyone else and more for Black women than any other women. And the reason for that wasn't that women had all of a sudden become more violent after the passage of mandatory arrest policies. The reason was the way that police were implementing those policies. So people who were supposed to be protected by these policies were actually being arrested in much greater numbers, both solely and in what are called dual arrests, where both people are arrested. And even kind of the passage of what are called primary aggressor laws, which are meant to try to figure out who was it who was really violent and let's only arrest that person. In some places haven't done much to mitigate that harm. And then there are all the kind of stigmas that come with criminalization and the real concrete consequences of criminalization, that you can't get access to some forms of housing, that you can't get access to public benefits, to some kinds of education loans, all of which would make you more economically stable, all of which would bring more community stability. So when you look at the harms that criminalization does, even if it was doing the work that some claim that it is doing, and that I believe that it is not, but even if it was doing that work, you would still have to ask, is the cost too high? And I think the cost is very much too high.
So you mentioned earlier, and I have a lot of sympathy for the point that it can be challenging to point out glaring problems with the current system, and then to be asked, well, how would you do it differently? As if you're being asked to invent out of whole cloth. How should society function, these difficult issues? But you have done this for a long time, and I'm sure you do have some thoughts about what some alternatives might look like, how we might go about dealing with these kinds of cases. What would you say to people if they ask, like, what should we do differently?
I have about a book's worth of thoughts on this.
Okay, so good time to plug the book, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm plugging the book. So in Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, what I do is suggest that we look at the problem of domestic violence through an economic lens, through a public health lens, and through a community-based lens. On the economic side of things, we could be doing things like putting resources into the hands of people who've been harmed. And there are organizations like Free From that do this amazing work of just saying to people, here's money. We know that economic stress is both entrapping you in a violent relationship or exacerbating the stress within your relationship. Here's resources. No strings attached, no accounting required, just deal with your problems, which is huge, right? We don't do that for anybody, but that's something that we could do. We could deal with the fact that male under and unemployment, and the research is very binary here, so I just want to kind of point that out, that when we talk about women as victims and men as perpetrators, that's both because what the statistics show us is that the vast majority of people who do harm are male, and the vast majority of people who are harmed are women, which is not to say that it doesn't happen in same-sex relationship or for non-binary people, but also to say that the research is really binary in that same way. And what the research shows is that male under and unemployment is one of the most significant correlates with the perpetration of intimate partner violence. So if we wanted to stop intimate partner violence, one thing that we could very well be doing is dealing with male under and unemployment, a problem that's gotten much worse with globalization. So this is where you get tied into kind of structural economic reform, right? What do we do about deindustrialization? What do we do about the loss of good living wage jobs? All of that is tied to dealing with intimate partner violence. Even raising the minimum wage, right? Even raising the minimum wage would make a significant impact on the perpetration of intimate partner violence. So that's one kind of pool of things that we could be doing. A second kind of pool of things that we could be doing is working around public health prevention, and that's in a number of different areas. We could be doing prevention work with adolescents, and there's great evidence-based work out there that we could be building on. And I should say, the Violence Against Women Act does some of that, but it could do a whole lot more. We could be doing intervention with people who use violence in ways that actually works. Traditional batterer intervention programs don't have a great track record, in part because they assume they know why people use violence rather than actually trying to figure out why people use violence. And they don't understand that you can look at things like trauma and economic stress not as excuses for someone's behavior, but as explanations for someone's behavior, and try to figure out how to intervene around those things. Similarly, you can intervene around substance abuse and around alcohol abuse without saying that those are excuses that we just aren't willing to be open to. We could do work around guns, and that single-handedly would do a tremendous amount towards decreasing intimate partner violence in the United States. I don't think I need to say anything more about that. We could do what's called edutainment, building information about intimate partner violence into entertainment in ways that people can hear and then kind of apply in their own lives. And there have been really great programs doing this in a number of different countries. So the public health response is all about prevention. The last thing is preventing adverse childhood experiences. So having adverse childhood experiences like witnessing domestic violence, witnessing community violence, being abused and neglected yourself is highly correlated with both perpetration and victimization. If we were intervening to give families what they need when they have children and preventing some of these adverse childhood experiences, we would decrease intimate partner violence down the line. Then the third thing is to think about how we can do this work without resorting to the state, and particularly without resorting to the carceral state, and that's the community-based work. So things like, people talk about restorative justice, and I just want to be clear that restorative justice is one very small piece of a much larger set of strategies and interventions that we should be talking about. People talk about restorative justice as though you're going to take the criminal legal system and kind of put it here on the side and then put RJ down and that's going to take care of it. And it's not. It's not, for any number of different reasons. But restorative justice, which is focused on kind of the questions of what was the harm, what was the impact of the harm, and what can be done to address that harm, what needs to be done to make it right. That kind of work in community, engaging community members to help keep people safe and to hold people accountable, is very much part of a community-based strategy. Some of the things that people have been doing during the pandemic are part of a community-based strategy. So people have been doing mutual aid and pod mapping. I'm trying to figure out who is it within my group of people that I rely on, that I can rely on for specific things, and who can rely on me. So in the context of intimate partner violence, pod mapping looks like I've got two friends. One of them I know I can always go to if I need a place to stay, like they've always got a couch for me. And the other one has always got $50, no questions asked, is never going to give me a hard time about paying it back. And the person who's got the couch never has cash. And the person who's got the money, they're already overcrowded. They can't take me in. But I know these people in my network can do these things for me, so I know where to turn if I have that problem. And I can do that in turn for other people. Forging those kinds of relationships, those really granular kinds of nitty-gritty relationships, is a really important part of community-based strategies. And people say that we can't do community-based work because there is no community left in the United States. It is challenging, but we have to think about community in all kinds of different ways. Community is not just geographic, it's religious and immigrant and ethnic and affinity and online. And so there are just lots of ways to think about this. People also say we can't do community work because community facilitates violence. And in some cases, that's true, right? When a community accepts someone's use of violence against a partner, that sends a message to both the person who's using violence and the person who's being harmed. But the idea that criminalization is a public response to violence, I think, is problematic, right? Because nobody sees really what happens in the criminal legal system. It's not like folks from the neighborhood are going in to learn about how these things are being handled. A true public response to violence engages community, teaches community, informs community, engages community in understanding why that use of violence is inappropriate and what they can do about it. And that is that's organizing work, right? And that's hard work. That's community, neighborhood level organizing work. But this isn't going to be an easy problem to solve. And if we aren't willing to look at it across all of these dimensions, we won't make a dent. And those aren't all of the dimensions that one could look at it. Those are just the ones that I happen to choose.
You made me just in talking about the purpose of community and the necessity of it. You brought to mind the politics of this issue and of the broader question of the role of policing and incarceration, and the way that, in my opinion, as somebody who's immersed in this stuff, especially right now, running myself, I really see a willingness to further disintegrate community and public senses of community in service of very short-term political goals around the idea of crime and safety. And one sort of notorious example that I've seen a lot of people talk about is a candidate for county executive here writing an op-ed in the local paper, Bethesda Magazine, where he claimed there were 50-person brawls in downtown Silver Spring, and that downtown Silver Spring, was unsafe. And a lot of us sort of laughed about it at the time. I live in Silver Spring. I'm downtown every weekend with my family. The farmers market still seems to be intact. I haven't seen any brawls, but on a more serious level, because I'm always canvassing too, and I'm talking with voters, I have now talked to a lot of people who live, in Wheaton or other parts of my district, who have said to me, well, downtown Silver Spring is so dangerous now. We don't go down there anymore. And the way in which that type of politics has actively furthered disintegration of community by making people more fearful, less willing, to be in a public space with their neighbors. I don't know. It feels like a little microcosm of this broader dynamic that you've been describing, where when we start to rely entirely on criminalization and the criminal legal system to solve these issues, we're really sort of on a downward spiral, because those are resources that are not going into these other approaches. And over time, we lose our sense of what the problem even was in the first place, because we're so fixated on how do we tweak the criminal legal system in just the right way to finally get it to work.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. There's this idea, Mills Christie wrote this paper a very long time ago about the ways that we've ceded our responsibility for harm and our responsibility for problems to the government. And in doing that, we've absolved ourselves of any responsibility for stepping in, but we've also made ourselves immune to whatever the system does. That we own, as communities, we have to own our problems. We have to own the harms that happen. And so these attempts to erode community are part of a struggle that keeps us from being able to reclaim responsibility for some of these problems, because we think that we don't have capacity to do it and that only the criminal legal system can do it. And
you mentioned, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but because you brought it up earlier, the role of firearms in all this, and the way in which our failure as a country to deal with gun violence really has drastically increased the level of risk that people rightly feel they could be taking on when they're intervening in certain situations, or deciding whether they would intervene in certain situations, seems to play a big role in that as well. There's justified fear.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's also, we don't equip people at all to intervene in any way. That's what community accountability is really about. It's about kind of helping people know what to do and what to say when somebody comes to them and says, I've been a victim of violence. There's, our first, our publicly funded first responders are police. But for most people, their first responder is a friend or a family member or a community member. And by failing to give them any tools at all to use when people come to them, we are doing victims a serious disservice. So I always get the question kind of, well, what do you do for people who want to use the criminal legal system, right? And I don't blame people right now who want to use the criminal legal system. It's the only thing we offer. If you're being harmed, the only thing we've told you to do is call 911. It's not as though we do the neighborhood work that we need to do. It's not as though we've done the preventative work that we need to do. And so I get that, right? It makes perfect sense that you'd want to do that. Unless and until we're willing to kind of seed this work and make it visible and really own it as communities, we're not going to have viable alternatives. One of the things I'm excited about is there are a couple of places in the country where alternatives to 911 are being tested. And in California, under the CARES Act, they didn't exclude domestic violence. So ordinarily when people do this stuff, they say, oh yeah, we can do it for everything except not domestic violence. We can't do it for domestic violence. But in California, they're doing that work. And I'm so excited to see what comes out of it. In Chicago, they're pairing violence interrupters and violence de-escalators with domestic violence people to go out together so that you have both of those forms of expertise to try to do that intervention. In Baltimore, I can tell you the Safe Streets guys who are doing that violence de-escalation, they're dealing with domestic violence all the time. They told me so, but nobody's told them how to do that properly. So we've got to be able to give people information about how do you intervene safely and effectively, and how do we pair that with the kind of information that can also allow us to deal with potentially more lethal situations. But we also have to stop assuming that every situation is lethal. They're not. Intimate partner violence runs the gamut from really hurtful speech to homicide. And not everything requires the same response. We have to figure out how we can give a differentiated response.
Something that you mentioned in a written piece that I saw, I'm trying to remember which one it was now. I think you cited the fact that something like 50% of instances, or maybe initial instances of domestic violence, actually go unreported. Am I getting that roughly correct, that statistic?
Not necessarily initial, but in any given year, what the National Crime Victimization Study says is that somewhere between 50 and 60% of folks don't report.
Right. So there's the flip side of everything you just said, which is that there's so many people who, for their own reasons, don't want to engage the criminal legal system at all, and so then they really have no alternative in most cases.
Yeah, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is going to come out with a new study any day now. I can't wait till it comes out. And what it's going to tell people is that some people don't call the police ever because they're terrified of what police will do. And some people call the police and they're terrified of what police would do. And 71% of those people wished there was something else. And they thought of all kinds of other else things. People don't necessarily want the criminal legal system involved in their lives. We just don't offer anything else.
I want to thank the folks who joined us live. And if you have questions for Professor Goodmark, please go ahead and drop them in the chat. But we do have one more thing to talk about while folks think about if they have any questions for us live. And that's, the role that parole reform plays in all of this. I mean, we're sort of, there are these much deeper issues we've been talking about, but we also have the very real human impacts in the here and now of people who have been caught up in this system, and what we can do as citizens, as leaders, as community members to get people out who should not be incarcerated. So can you speak a little bit about the status of parole reform in Maryland and where we need to go from here?
Yeah, so as I said at the beginning, for the last 8 years, I've been representing incarcerated survivors of violence, many of whom had minimal, if any, involvement in the crimes for which they are incarcerated. Some of whom had lots of involvement, but were acting in self-defense or under duress. And for all of them, they come up against a parole system that is fixated on the nature and circumstances of the crime that brought them there, to the exclusion of almost anything else. We've been very lucky and worked very hard over a 10-year period of time. Until last year, the governor was removed from parole decisions for lifers. So until last year, even if the Maryland Parole Commission had decided that someone had been sufficiently rehabilitated that they should be released, the governor could veto that, and did pretty frequently, beginning with actually Governor Glendening in 1995 saying life means life, and going straight through to Governor Hogan. Before Governor Hogan, not a single lifer had been released on straight parole. Under Governor Hogan, that number increased a little bit, probably because he was being sued by the ACLU at the time, because of the failure to provide a meaningful right to parole in Maryland. That lawsuit has settled, and Governor Hogan has certainly done more than his predecessors, but having the governor out of parole is great. That doesn't mean we're done. Medical and geriatric parole in Maryland are a complete and utter mess. The medical parole system is almost impossible to use. You essentially have to be dying, literally dying, within days of dying, before you can get medical parole. Geriatric parole is put in a part of the Maryland code that makes it so that only repeat offenders are eligible. I hate that word offender. I can't believe I just used it. Only people who've committed more than one crime or been convicted of more than one crime are eligible for geriatric parole. What that means is that people who've only ever been incarcerated once are not eligible. It's a mistake, but nobody has fixed it yet. And so the two big things that I think are on the horizon are fixing medical and geriatric parole so that people who've served ridiculously long sentences have a mechanism for being released, and so that people who can't possibly do harm to anyone because they are so debilitated can also be released. From there, we need to start thinking about, the way that parole operates in Maryland more generally. There is no right to counsel in parole. People go through those hearings without representation, without a true understanding of what's happening to them. The Parole Commission can deny people parole outright. And so what that means is, even if you had a parolable sentence, the Maryland Parole Commission can say, nope, you're no longer parolable unless and until we say you are. That changes the sentence fundamentally. That cannot be something that we allow to happen. And it happens every day. I have clients for whom every 2 years we ask the Parole Commission to reconsider, and every 2 years they tell us no, regardless of what the person has done. And so there are a number of things on our way to abolition that we can be doing to try to get people out, as many people out as best we can.
Professor Leigh Goodmark, thanks so much for your time this evening. It looks like we might have one question. Could you talk about, Stephanie, do you want to just come off mute and ask your question?
Sure. Sorry. Hi, Professor Goodmark. Sorry, the question was so long, but you talked about sort of the macro impact of our court system, how incarceration impacts families and economics, and you talked about how it's not a deterrent. But I wondered if you could elaborate more on something I see every day in court, and that is just the traumas caused by court hearings and by coming to court and by what happens in those court hearings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, those traumas run both ways. So first, in terms of being a criminal defendant, right? Just having to go into that system where you are looked at as less than, you are treated as less than, you are treated as someone who's done the worst thing that people can think of to have ever done, right? Without any understanding of your trauma, without any understanding of your history, you still have the presumption of innocence, more or less, but not as much as one would think, particularly if you've been held, for example, on bail. And in cases involving intimate partner violence, people are held, even though we had bail reform in Maryland, people are frequently held. So there's all of that on that side of it. On the victim side of it, it's equally destructive, because you come in and your time is not regarded, and you come in 2 or 3 times, and this is somebody who you care about. And if you continue to care about them, the state's attorney might say to you, well, you can't stay in that relationship, and we're going to force you to testify. And at least in Baltimore City, if you choose not to comply with our subpoena, we're going to have you arrested and held until you do testify. And so there are harms that are done on both sides. I think there are also harms that are done by judges who think that They are supporting victims of violence by being excessively punitive and by being insulting and demeaning to the defendants who come before them. What that says to the person who's been in a relationship with that person is, this is how the judge looks at your loved one. This is how the judge looks at your choice about who you chose to spend your life with. I think that's harmful on both sides too. And what the procedural justice literature says is, when you treat people fairly, they are more likely to comply with court orders. There's a real benefit to courts in treating people fairly and justly, and oftentimes we just don't see it. So I agree, Stephanie. I think the court system is a horrible place for most people to be. And that, leaving out, of course, for some of my clients who are victims of violence, what happens when their partners are acquitted, and the message that that sends as well. So there are lots of different dimensions upon which the court system is destructive.
I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to close this out. There's so much more we could talk about. I'm really grateful to you, Professor Goodmark, for spending time with us this evening. This is such a difficult issue to be thoughtful about, and especially, again, in the context of politics, where there are so many bad actors and folks who are looking for very short-term gains by shooting up fear and distrust. I can't recommend your work highly enough. I hope folks will go buy your books from unionized booksellers, and look you up. You have a website too, right? Can we plug your website?
I do. It's leighgoodmark.com.
LEIGH Goodmark.com. Thanks so much for being here, and
Thank
thanks
you so much
for
for
watching.
having me. Thanks for having the conversation.
Absolutely. I'm going to stop our stream.